Welcome my friends, this is Maniacal Incorporated, continuing my tour of Ireland in Crusader Kings 3 and detailing the lives of its many rulers. Today we make for the province of Leinster, from the Irish line, named for a population group that claimed descent from Uí Dunlainge, a mythological high king with horse's ears and Gaulish mercenaries. In the 4th and 5th centuries, as Roman Britain collapsed, raiders from Leinster crossed the sea and established settlements in Wales. Some historians think that this may have been due to pressure from the Uí Néill, the descendants of Conn Céad Cathaoc, as they emerged out of Connacht and drove the line out of Meath. The 12th century Book of Leinster details a cattle tribute which was supposedly claimed by the Uí Néill kings from Leinster, which included 15,000 cattle, 15,000 pigs, and 15,000 chains of silver. Now it's possible that this was a piece of propaganda to show how cruel the Uí Néill were and how successful Leinster was in resisting their demands. One account, from the Leabhar Gabhála Éireann, the Book of Invasions, says that Niall of the Nine Hostages waged war on Leinster over the tribute due to him, but was killed by Ucha, the son of Leinster's king, Uí Ceinnselaig. The descendants of Uí would call themselves the Uí Ceinnselaig, and one of their number, Corpora Mac Diarmada, rules Leinster in the 867 start in Crusader Kings 3. In reality, however, the Uí Ceinnselaig had been excluded from power after the 7th century, and the historical king of Leinster at this time was Dunlainge Mac Muirdig, a namesake and descendant of Éanna's first cousin, the founder of the Uí Dunlainge dynasty. It looks likely that whoever provided Paradox with the Irish genealogies for Crusader Kings 2 used a copy of Irish Kings and High Kings, and I can only imagine that they had a minor stroke when they turned to the page showing the Uí Dunlainge Kings of Leinster. At first glance it appears as though the province followed a bizarre and borderline incomprehensible system of succession, possibly tanistry ramped up to 100. But it's actually quite simple. On the death of Murchad, the ruling Uí Dunlainge king of Leinster in 727, he was succeeded in turn by his 4 sons, and after this the descendants of 3 of them, the Uí Dunlainge, the Uí Fuailóin, and the Uí Muirdig, rotated the leadership of the Uí Dunlainge dynasty, and with it the kingship of Leinster, between themselves for almost 300 years. Tanistry didn't apply to titles, as Paradox has implemented it. It was used within clans or septs to determine who would succeed as chief. But that's a video for another day. Rotating power within a dynasty wasn't unusual in medieval Ireland. Famously, we have the northern and southern Uí Néill rotating the kingship of Tara, often conflated with the High Kingship of Ireland, between themselves for a few hundred years. The systems in Crusader Kings, however, doesn't really allow for this, so I guess they just dropped the Uí Dunlainge and put in the simplified genealogy of the excluded South Leinster Uí Ceinnselaig. I dealt briefly with Ossory in the last video. In 867 it had recently split off from Munster, and though closely associated with Leinster, it was its own sub-kingdom. Another event to impact Leinster just before the 867 start was the seizure by Vikings of the ecclesiastical settlement of Dubh Linn, named for the Black Pool it was located by. Over time the Uí Dunlainge formed alliances with the Vikings, and in 1014 at the Battle of Clontarf, Moelmorda mac Murcha of the Uí Fuailóin commanded the forces of Leinster and the Norse forces of his nephew Sitric, the King of Dublin. Though his armies were defeated, Dublin was saved, but Moelmorda's death in battle, the subsequent blinding of his son Bran by a very ungrateful Sitric, and dynastic infighting led to the Uí Dunlainge's collapse and the restoration of the Uí Ceinnselaig. So in the 1066 start we find that Leinster is ruled by Diarmid mac Donnacha, who was indeed the historical ruler at this time. His father is more famously known as Moel na Mo, a nickname roughly meaning a devotee of or an expert on cattle. This may be a reference to his success raiding his enemies for cattle, which was the main source of wealth in medieval Ireland. But Diarmid mac Moel na Mo wasn't a lowly count, as depicted here by Paradox. He ruled as High King of Ireland. Capitalising on the weakened state of the Uí Dunlainge, Diarmid drove them from power and subjugated Ossory. He seized Dublin and installed his own son and heir as its new king before forming an alliance with Connacht and attacking his father-in-law, Donnacha Uí Bhríon, in Munster. After deposing him, Diarmid installed Donnacha's nephew, Thorluk, as its new king in 1063. Thorluk accepted Diarmid's overlordship and the two of them raided Connacht to gain its submission. So by 1066, Diarmid is the preeminent ruler on the island of Ireland, and later, at the peak of his power, he hosted the sons of Harold Godwinson and offered support in their bid to reclaim England from William the Conqueror. The peak didn't last for very long, however. In 1070, his son Murcha died from wounds received in a failed raid on Meath. 2 years later, when Meath attacked Leinster and killed Diarmid, they were supported by Thorluk, who would soon retake Diarmid's possessions and claim the High Kingship for himself. So why is Diarmid presented as just a lowly count in Crusader Kings 3? It's partially because the mechanics in the game are unable to represent many of the unique aspects of medieval Irish politics. But it's mostly because Paradox wants to keep Ireland noob-friendly. It's understandable that in some cases historical accuracy has to be constrained by what is possible and by what is fun, and I'll look at how good, or how bad, of a job Paradox has done of balancing this in a later video. I have absolutely no idea why they made him Catholic though, while everyone else is insular Christian. That just makes no sense. From the 11th century onwards, modern Irish surnames began to develop as dynasties highlighted their descent from powerful individuals, and you might think that the Uí Ceinnselaig would have adopted the name of Diarmid, considering he had restored them to power in Leinster and claimed the High Kingship. Instead, the main branch of his descendants called themselves the Mac Murcha, after his son, which might seem a little strange. Other than getting himself killed, Murcha's short rule of Dublin was fairly uneventful. But that's the important part. He was King of Dublin. Leinster was secure and the Uí Dunlainge were crushed. By taking the name Mac Murcha, they were highlighting their right to rule Dublin. By far the largest port on the island, with access to extensive trade and mercenary networks, Dublin was becoming increasingly important in medieval Irish politics. As a result, Leinster, Munster and Connacht all sought to exert control over it. Murcha's son Donnacha died in 1115 while trying to retake Dublin from the Uí Bhríon, and his nephew Diarmid briefly ruled as king before his death in 1117. In 1118, the ascendant Uí Crusader in Connacht took Dublin and allowed Donnacha's son Aine to rule the city in their name until his death in 1126. Aine was succeeded as King of Leinster by his younger brother, Diarmid Mac Murcha, who the Uí Crusader immediately attempted to depose. Diarmid held on to his kingdom, and infighting within the Uí Crusader meant that they had enough to deal with, so an uneasy peace reigned. Shortly after gaining the High Kingship in 1166, however, Rory Uí Crusader restarted the family's war against Diarmid and drove him from power. Diarmid eventually found himself in the English court, offering his daughter's hand in marriage in return for Norman military aid to retake Leinster. The next 800 or so years are going to be crazy. And finally, we'll take a look at Ossory. In the 1030s, Donnacha Mac Gilpatrick briefly ruled as King of Leinster, and his son Donal has kept the Mac Gilpatrick surname, which later becomes Mac Gilfodrig. Gilla can mean a servant of or follower of, and is common in religious forenames, such as Gilpatrick, the servant of St. Patrick, and Gilla Isa, the servant of Jesus. After the Norman invasion, the Mac Gilfodrig would Normanize their surname to Fitzpatrick to elevate their status. Leinster's fairly small in CK3, so we haven't had much to go over today, but hopefully you now have some additional context on its rulers, especially Diarmid Mac Moel na Mo. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you will return next time for a trip to Connacht.